What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt. If you haven't joined me before, I go really deep on specific topics in the current limited format, so individual decks, individual cards, sort of drafting strategies. And this week we're going to be talking about all flavors of red aggro in Tarkir Dragonstorm. So before I dive in, I just want to mention something. I had a couple people find me on YouTube, and they asked me if they could find the podcast feed in, the normal podcast apps. And the answer is yes. I just want to mention this. I'm on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, etc. If there's a place that you usually get your podcasts and I'm not on there, please let me know. So just wanted to shout that out in case you found me on YouTube and you want to listen on Spotify instead. So with that out of the way, let's dive into red aggro. So before I dive into the specifics in Tarkir, I want to just talk about kind of a big picture view of aggro decks, some discussion on aggro decks in the past 5-ish years. So it's no secret that the 2020s decade so far for limited Magic has been fairly dominated by aggro. There are definitely various reasons for that, but I think the one that I want to focus on and talk about is that the intrinsically strongest cards in the sets for the past 5 or so years have been cheap and good at attacking. A couple examples in recent sets are like Novice Inspector, just 1 mana 1/2. Waterwind Scout from LCI, which was like the 2/2 flyer. Preening Champion from March of the Machine. You had cards like Clockwork Percussionist and Turn Inside Out in Duskmourn that were kind of format-defining commons. You had Intrepid Rabbit in Bloomburrow, Cut In Wilds of Eldraine, even all the way up to entire mechanics, like the Unearth mechanic was very dominant in Brothers War. The Decayed mechanic was dominant in Midnight Hunt. They've just been costing things in the past 5 years so that the cheap cards and the cards that are good at attacking are the ones that have dominated the limited format, just on rate. And when that's the case, attacking with cheap creatures becomes the aggregate best thing to do. If you just go into the draft and take the best cards on rate, for a lot of the recent limited formats, you end up by default with a deck that is good at attacking. And this is not to say that you can't build a defensive deck in the formats in the past 5 years. It just takes a lot of creativity, or a lot more creativity than just taking the best card out of the pack, which leads you down an aggro direction. And it also takes you shifting your card evaluation drastically to get there. And what that means is that it's not going to show up in the 17 lands win rate data, and it's not going to shape the narrative of the format. So there have been plenty of, slower mid-range control decks over the past 5 years, but the story of the format, which is defined by the strongest cards in the format, is that these formats have been very conducive to attacking with cheap creatures. And I want to mention this because the paradigm has pretty dramatically shifted so far in the first 2 sets of 2025. The default best thing to do in Aetherdrift, like what the best cards in the set at lower rarities led you to do, was green monsters. And in Tarkir Dragonstorm, it's not cheap aggressive cards that have the best rate, it's the cheap interaction. So now instead of the best cards in the format leading you into a space where you want to attack, the onus is on the aggro decks to attack and find ways to push damage creatively. So I want to take a quick trip back to 2014, or like me, if you weren't playing limited in 2023, when they brought Khans of Tarkir back to Arena. Khans of Tarkir had good aggro decks, but the card quality, like if you just took the best card in the pack, the best cards in the draft weren't leading you necessarily towards a good beatdown deck. And what I found, what was really interesting when I played Khans of Tarkir for the first time back in 2023 when they brought it back, was the aggro decks really had to go out of their way to find ways to push damage. And that was either with Trumpet Blasts, which is like the Anthem effect that gives +2 to your team for a turn, or Khans had a lot of like burn. Like there was a card called Arrow Storm that could just deal 4 damage to face. So the aggro decks in that format were very good. They were very strong, but they needed you to go out of your way and take cards like Trumpet Blast that might not necessarily be in a vacuum the strongest, 17 lands game in hand win rate card. They needed to go out of their way to find ways to push damage. And I think that as they move away from pushing the cheap creatures in newer limited formats like they have for Aetherdrift and Tarkir, I think in order to build successful aggro decks, You need to find more creative ways to push damage in your aggro decks. Now, Boros Aggro in Tarkir is very, very good. And I think that deck in particular is very straightforward. Kind of just the red-white or Mardu go wide deck. Like, you can go to 17 lands, you can look at the win rate data. It's very clear that just building a go wide beatdown aggro deck is pretty simple. But I think there's a lot of other flavors of Boros Aggro, and I think there's a lot of other flavors of red aggressive decks that I'm going to talk about today that are much less obvious. So I think in aggro decks in general, small card choices make a really big impact, and I'm going to be going through the different red decks that I've drafted, go over each one, and pick out a bunch of cards that would change the way that I built these decks. So before I go into the individual decks, I'm going to talk about red in general and talk about a couple red commons that I really like. First off is Molten Exhale, which is the 2-mana deal 4 at common. I mentioned last week that I might bump this up past Sibsig Appraiser for the best common, and I am in that camp now. Big part of that is a metagame consideration. I really like that starting in red lets me pivot to either Mardu or Temur, but Molten Exhale is really incredible. The threats in this format are not very big. There's a lot of like 3/3 and 4/4 dragons. So I think this is a premium card in every red deck that you build, and I take this card very highly. So I think one interesting thing about Tarkir this time around is there is a dearth of strong 2s, and I think red gets 2 very good 2-drops at common. The first one is Shock Brigade, which is the 2-mana 1/3 with Menace and Mobilize 1. I think this is the best common aggressive 2-drop in the format. I think it's very underrated. I get it pretty early. And I would play the first couple copies of this in any aggro deck. I think it's a really good card. Even like green-red Stompy, which I'm going to talk about later. A 1/3 Menace isn't exactly ideal for that deck, but I still think it plays very, very well because it pushes so much damage. The other red 2-drop I want to talk about is Jeskai Devotee, which is the 2-mana Devotee, so it can filter to Jeskai mana, and then it has a flurry ability and gets +1/+1 if you've cast 2 spells this turn. I think the mana filtering abilities of the Devotees has turned out to be pretty solid. I really like this card. I like that it attacks as a 3/3 in my aggressive decks. In defensive decks, I still think it's good. Like, the mana filtering is great. You're still going to need to play some 2-drops in a lot of your decks. So yeah, Jeskai Devotee, definitely worse than Shock Brigade. Not a super high pick, but I see these like wheeling pretty often, or I get them like pick 7, pick 8. And this is something that I bumped up quite a bit over the past week. So as a lead into going into detail on all of the different aggro decks I've been playing, I want to briefly touch on building and playing aggro decks in general. So aggro decks for the last couple years have been pretty easy to build. You know, like I said before, you can kind of just take the best cards and they naturally lead you into a beatdown deck. But I think in a lot of formats where that's not the default thing to be doing, it really requires a lot of nuance to understanding your deck's own game plan. So for example, are you a go wide deck? Are you going to be kind of biding your time until you build a large board and doing an alpha strike with an anthem? Are you winning with flyers? Are you a tempo deck? You know, are you leveraging mana advantages from, counter spells, bounce spells with cheap threats? Are you a stompy deck where you're just trying to play threat after threat after threat and overwhelm your opponent's removal? Really thinking about these sort of things can help you figure out how you're actually winning the game, and can also reveal how you can beat what your opponent is doing. Like, what is your deck weak to? How do you shore that up? Is it even worth shoring that up? When the aggro decks are not obvious, it requires a lot of shifting card evaluation and a lot of really hard gameplay. The margins in aggro decks can be incredibly tight, and you have to make a lot of attacks that look crazy, like chump attacks, just like passing the turn with all your mana up, biding your time, etc. Really small mistakes can be the difference between a win or a loss. So instead of going in detail on all of those topics, I want to point you towards an episode of Lords of Limited. It's a really old episode. It was an episode they did with Ryan Sachs, who used to be a really awesome limited content creator for Star City Games. And he talks about building aggro decks in Guilds of Ravnica, which was, oh my God, I think 6 years ago at this point, maybe 7 years ago. And it's an interesting thing to go back and listen to, because this is kind of before the time when the aggro decks kind of built themselves. I know I'm being very reductive about that, but it's in the era when you had to go out of your way to build aggro decks and to build good aggro decks. So I think it's really interesting to go back that far, listen to how the card evaluation was just different in general back then. So yeah, I'll link that in the description. I would highly recommend listening to that episode. It can really change how you think about true aggro decks rather than just, generic beatdown decks that are good at attacking. And as an example of how your card evaluation can drastically change based on the flavor of aggro deck you are, I'm going to talk about the card Wild Ride, the eponymous card of this episode. So Wild Ride is single mana sorcery. Creature gets +3/+0 and haste, and then it has Harmonize for 5 mana. This is a callback to Reckless Charge, which is the same card, but it has Flashback for 3 mana. And it is performing horribly in the 17 lands win rate data. It is at like a 51%. And this actually makes a lot of sense to me. This is a card that I like, but it's a horrible fit for the normal build of the red-white aggro deck in this format. The normal build of Boros in this format is just a go wide aggro deck. You're making a lot of creatures. You're punishing your opponent for playing smaller creatures. You're punishing their cheap interaction because you're making multiple bodies. And Wild Ride does not fit in that game plan as well, because if you have 5 creatures and your opponent has 1 or 2 creatures and you Wild Ride one of your creatures and it becomes the biggest threat, they just get to block that and completely negate the damage that you got out of Wild Ride. So it's a terrible fit for these red-white aggro decks, but there's other kinds of aggro decks in this format that I don't think are very reflected in the data at this time. The card is really incredible with evasion as burst damage. So a card that I really like that I mentioned before is Shock Brigade, which has Menace. Shock Brigade already taxes your opponent's blockers. They need 3 blockers to completely negate the damage with the Mobilize and Menace. So Wild Ride on your Shock Brigade can pretty immediately push 4 damage out of nowhere, which is a pretty great spot to be for 1 mana. Other cards with evasion that I really like with Wild Ride are Sun Pearl Kirin in red-white. This is the 2-mana 2/1 flyer that can bounce something back to your hand and has flash. Just kind of out of nowhere, if you just play 2/1 flyer, give it +3/+0, smash for 5. Like you spent 1 mana to deal 5 damage. That's an awesome rate in an aggro deck. Another card that I am going to talk about today that I've had a little bit of good experience with is Tempest Hawk, which is the 3-mana 2/2 Squadron Hawk variant. Again, it has flying. It just comes out of nowhere, hits your opponent for 5. And the Hawk sets you up to have more flying bodies for subsequent turns for if you draw your Wild Ride later. In blue, you have, so blue-red aggro, you have Runescale Storm Brood, which is the blue-red dragon. It's like a 4-mana red 2/4 flyer that gets +2/+0 whenever you cast a spell. An instant sorcerer dragon spell. So, Wild Ride that thing, that's 7 damage, I think, out of nowhere. Wingblade Disciple. This is the 3-mana 2/2 flyer that makes a bird on flurry. This is another fantastic thing to pair with Wild Ride. Wild Ride is a single red mana. So on turn 4, you can make a 2/2, a 1/1, and then smash your opponent for 5. So you can sense the theme here. Evasion is huge with Wild Ride. And the red-white decks in general just aren't playing very many evasive threats. They're kind of getting around the opponent's blockers by playing more creatures than they can block. Moving on, Wild Ride in green works really well with one of my favorites, Champion of Doosan, which is the 3-mana 4/2 Trample. Trample is an effective form of evasion. It taxes your opponent for having small blockers. So Champion of Doosan immediately pushes 7 damage with Wild Ride, and the trample counter that it gives works too. And another card that I really like, Synchronized Charge. This is the one that puts counters on your creatures and gives them vigilance and trample. Again, gives trample. Wild Ride just is able to surprise your opponent with a very large amount of damage, not just once, but twice. And yes, the Harmonize cost is pretty awkward, but I find that I'm often very happy just casting the front face in a lot of games, just the 1-mana mode. So hopefully by looking at Wild Ride in particular, you can see how a card like this isn't going to perform well in every aggro deck, and it's not even going to perform well in the best aggro deck in the format. But if you're really thinking hard about your deck's game plan, you can find spots where a card like Wild Ride is amazing. So I'm going to go through all of the different aggro decks that I've been drafting and talk about a lot of these cards like Wild Ride that I'm able to shift my card evaluation and really maximize them. So starting off, I'll touch on White Red. I'm not going to go very deep on White Red because I do think it's fairly obvious. It's a go wide deck. Most builds of White Red are pretty straightforward. I do want to shout out Mardu Devotee, which I have bumped up to the best white common. I've seen a lot of people joking. I've joked a lot that it's literally Thraben Inspector. And I think, Thraben Inspector is definitely better. But I think the comparison is actually pretty apt. It has this effect on the game that's very non-obvious. Like I said, the margins in aggro decks are very slim. So being able to scry away a single land in the early game or the late game, having an extra red pip so you can double spell on turn 3 or 4, these kinds of things are really important. And I think this is a very similar card to Novice and Thraben Inspector in that it's hard to clock the effect of the game that these really have. Seeing an extra card, etc. So I think it's still very underrated, and I do think this is the best white common and crucial for basically every white-red deck. I want to touch on Tempest Hawk also in white-red. I had a very, very good Tempest Hawk white-red aggro deck. I want probably at least 3, ideally 4, I think. I played 5 in this deck. When I realized I was in Tempest Hawk white-red, I was very, very picky about the cards that were 3 mana and above because I was just assuming that I was going to be casting a Tempest Hawk for every turn for the remainder of the game. So the cheap cards are going to be so much more important than the expensive cards, which is, true in general, but I was really deprioritizing cards like that. So I did play a War Effort, which is the 4 mana Anthem enchantment, because that buffs all my Tempest Hawks. Frontline Rush was very good in this deck. I had a lot of evasive flyers, so the big damage burst was excellent. I didn't play the Wild Ride. It was my last cut, but Wild Ride I do think is great with Tempest Hawk, like I mentioned. And I also wanted really good interaction in this deck. You want good interaction in every deck, but it was especially important because you kind of get brickwiled by a single dragon. So making sure you're saving your interactions for the flying blockers so you can continue to get in with your Wind Drakes, I think is really important. So Narset's Rebuke in particular was really good with Tempest Hawk because it adds 3 mana to cast more Hawks. I'm going to leave white-red there. I think it's pretty obvious. But now I want to talk about blue-red. So blue-red aggro, blue-red tempo was brought to my attention by someone I know in the limited level ups Discord, who goes by Jimbo. That's like his tag. He said he was kind of forcing blue-red for science. And he actually recorded an unlisted YouTube video of him building and piloting one of these blue-red aggro decks. And it really tipped me off to that, and I was able to trophy with it myself. He's a very, very good player. He got, I think, 11th in Denver the other weekend. And I really needed to see someone build this deck and play it for me to understand what is going on here. So I would highly recommend checking out the YouTube video. This is one of the cases where the deck is not only difficult to draft, it is extremely difficult to play. You have to be very, very patient about deploying your threats. Very patient about when you're attacking. You have to often wait for your opponent to get a little greedy to get a lot of burst damage in. So yeah, another reason to check out the video. I will say with his deck, he had 4 Glacial Dragon Hunts. With my deck that I trophied with this, I had double Quarry Steelcutter. So I do think you need extenuating circumstances to get into this deck. But if you're drafting a lot, stuff like that does happen. So it's definitely something to keep your eye out for. The core conceit of this deck is that flurry tempo is a very real thing. So like I mentioned how much I like Jeskai Devotee. There's also Reverberating Summons, which is the 2 mana enchantment that turns into a 3/3 on your combat with haste if you've double spelled. And you can also pay 2 mana, sack it to discard your hand and draw 2 cards. I thought this card was going to be straight garbage. I don't think it's amazing everywhere, but a 3/3 attacker, when you know you're the dedicated aggro deck, is very strong, and the discard mode is really good too. So this is one that's not a complete blank. I actually really like it in these decks. River Wheel Sweep. This is the Jeskai 2-Brid uncommon. It taps something down for, I think, 3 turns, and you get to basically draw a card from it. think this card is still extremely underrated. Definitely keep your eye out for it. You can play it just as 4 mana, tap and draw in this deck, and it's still amazing. But, often if you're in like this tempo space, you might be splashing white too. I want to shout out Wingblade Disciple as a reason to get into this deck. That's the 3 mana 2/2 flyer that makes birds on flurry. Again, pairs really nicely with Wild Ride, pairs really nicely with cantrips, which are very, very important to this deck. So that's Unending Whisper and Glacial Dragon Hunt, which, you can cast without discarding anything. Just being able to trigger flurry turn after turn, not run out of gas. Cantrip's very important. You're generally trying to keep the board pretty small in these decks. You want to deploy a couple threats and keep your opponent off balance. That's really the hallmark of a tempo deck in general. And a card that lets you do that I actually haven't cast myself is Ringing Strike Mastery. This is the single mana blue aura at common that taps and stuns indefinitely an opponent's creature, but they can pay 5 mana to untap it. Just a 1 mana way to keep the board small, tap a blocker. Yeah, this card definitely has a home here. I don't think it's a great playable. Like if you have a bunch of Molten Exhales and Ureni's Rebuff and Riverwalk Technique, you definitely don't need to play it, but definitely something I have my eye on. So I would definitely keep my eye out for this deck. Not something I'm trying to go into as a plan A, but it's felt really strong when you get a really good version of it. And I'm going to pivot back to white-red for a second. I mentioned this flurry deck as a blue-red tempo deck. I actually had a white-red deck that I would say fits this description better than the average white-red deck. I'm going to link all of my red aggro decks that I've drafted in the description. But this deck had 5 1-drops. This is really the thing here. It had 2 Descendant of Storms and 3 Mardu Devotees. And rather than playing a go wide game plan, I had 2 Jeskai Devotees and 2 Reverberating Summons, which really got online with 5 1-drops. So being able to play a 2-drop and a 1-drop on turn 3 and immediately trigger these was really powerful. I also had double Quarry Mountain Stalwart, which is the 3 mana red-white 3/3 that Flurry drains to. That was very good in this, double spell, 1-drop heavy, aggressive deck as well. This really fits the theme of what I've been saying. The go wide is the default white-red deck, but as long as you know what your deck's game plan is as the aggro deck, you can really get creative with things and drastically shift your card evaluation around based on the cards that are available to you. So like I saw a couple of Quarry Mountain Stalwarts and I was like, oh, if I have a lot of 1-drops, I'm going to be triggering Flurry a bunch. So Reverberating Summons is actually going to be good here. And the last flavor of red aggro deck I'm going to talk about is red-green, which is my white whale of this format. Maybe not white whale because I've actually done it already, but red-green Stompy, red-green Tricks, really sweet deck. I think in general, people should be less shy about drafting the allied base pairs in this format. So like red-green. In the allied base pairs, you lose access to the uncommon 2-color cards. So like you probably aren't going to be playing a Kishla Skimmer in this type of deck, but you still get access to 3-color cards. So you can be red-green with a light blue splash. And I think you really don't give up that much by being an allied base. So as another example, like I've been blue-white control quite a bit. So you're basically a Jeskai control deck, but your cheap cards are like Dispelling Exhale and Osseous Exhale. So in red-green, you are way more a stompy deck than a go wide or a tempo deck. So this is basically what I've discussed, I think every week for the past 2-3 weeks. You just want to play big threat after big threat, tax your opponent's removal, Champion of Doosan, Sagu Pummeler, a bunch of tricks. I mentioned before, I still really like Shock Brigade in this deck. The 2-drops are important for getting on board and attacking. And while this isn't the biggest thing, doesn't utilize the tricks as well, it's still something that's going to push damage every turn. Like if you play a Shock Brigade on turn 2 on the play, your opponent is basically starting the game at like 15 life. So like I said, I've already mentioned red-green a couple times in this podcast. I won't go too deep onto this. A couple other cards I really like are Equilibrium Adept, which is the 2/4 for 4 mana. It's a red uncommon. It has, when it enters, you get to exile the top card of your library and play it until your next turn. And then if it has Flurry, gains Double Strike. Double Strike is a very good keyword to pair with Trample, so Champion of Doosan counter, or Synchronized Charge, the 2 mana sorcery. I had a red-green kind of tricks deck where my Equilibrium Adept was pretty regularly enormous and killing my opponent through like Dragonclaw Strike, which is the 3-mana Temur 2-brid card, and trample damage. Another kind of off the wall card that I've been growing fond of is Meticulous Artisan. This is the 4-mana 3/3 prowess in red. When it enters, make a treasure. The treasure token pairs nicely with a couple cards I love in this deck. One is Snakeskin Veil. I think Snakeskin Veil is so important to these decks. Casting your Artisan for 4 mana, but immediately getting the rebate, being able to hold up Veil is excellent in these decks. So you don't have to use the Veil on the Artisan. The other card it pairs with is Wild Ride. You can immediately make your Artisan a 7/4 haste for 4 mana. That's very, very good too. And it pairs nicely, of course, with Trample from Champion of Yusan. Mostly a stompy deck in my mind, like you're still playing 5-drops, but I have seen people keep the curve really low, play a ton of 2-drops, a ton of champions, and then really leverage tricks like Sarkhan's Resolve, something like Fire Rim Form, which is this like bad flash aura in red that gives +2/+0 in first strike. I think Dragonclaw Strike and Synchronized Charge are essential for these decks just to push damage. Yeah, these decks are sweet. I'm still chasing it. I have kind of trophied with one kind of red-green deck. It had a lot of blue in it. I'm not sure if that counts. And I had a very near miss in best of 3 with a really good red-green tricks deck with a couple Equilibrium Adepts. So yeah, I love this deck. I'm obsessed with it. Last but not least, or maybe last but yes least, is Black-Red. I've seen it. I think a lot of things either have to go really right or really wrong. Like I could see if you start very deep in red and then you open something like Karsi Revenant, which is a great black rare, you could move into this and still play some Mardu cards. I would imagine Black-Red is more a mid-range deck, like you're playing like Sonic Shriekers at the top end. Like I said, I've seen this a couple times. I don't really think it has synergy in the way that a green-red tricks deck or a blue-red tempo deck does. So yeah, I think this is definitely the worst allied color pair. I know I said the allied color pairs I think are pretty viable. This one, not so much. And that's going to wrap it up. I hope you enjoyed this dive into aggro decks both in general and in Tarkir. I've really been focused on building base red decks this week because, like I said, I really like that it gives me the option to pivot both into Mardu and Temur. I hope this helped you conceptualize all the different things you can do with aggro in this format, because I think this format is really unique in that there's so much nuance between each deck. So like I said, like, are you a go wide? Are you a tempo deck, etc.? So I've been having a blast in Tarkir. I can't wait to figure out what I'm going to be working on this week. Hopefully I get to play more green-red tricks decks. So yeah, before I sign off, I want to shout out that I did fire up my first Twitch stream last week. I have like a job and responsibilities and everything. So this podcast is very much a hobby for me. I don't have enough time to devote to streaming, on a regular basis, but I think I'm going to be streaming very occasionally at samp_mtg on Twitch. If you have any feedback, if you want to say hi, if you want to suggest a card or topic for subsequent weeks, you can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social. I'm also on Discord at samp6. Thanks for listening and see you next week.